How's it going, everybody? So in this video, we're going to be discussing scientific research in relationship to nutrition, health, reversing disease, preventing disease, exercise science, recommended daily nutrient intakes, and even more subjective forms of science like psychology and mental illness. Okay, we're going to be talking about, I guess, what I'll label it as the science-based scam or something like that. Even though it's not really a scam, the way that people use research and evidence and science as a guiding tool rather than an explanatory tool about why certain things work is really where the fallacy lies. So listen, my channel used to be heavily all about the more intricate, complex, scientific underworkings and mechanisms. We used to be all about cohort studies, mechanistic data, epidemiology, meta-analysis, randomized controlled trials, and to a large degree, we still discuss these things on this channel, but a lot of people who have been with me since 2016 and above, which is a long time ago, have probably noticed I've kind of moved away progressively from speaking in scientific terms per se, and we focus a lot more on real-world experiences these days with using evidence and research and mechanistic studies as an explanatory tool now to explain why people get the results that they do. This is a very important video to make. Unfortunately, no one wants to hear these things because everybody wants to assume that they have the right answers. And a lot of people wrongfully assume that science is a study of facts, and if you are following, the scientific consensus, that you are as close to facts as possible or something like that, when the reality is it's just not true. So remember, I'm all about scientific research and evidence, and I mean that to the fullest extent. In fact, not only do I follow the greatest researchers in the field, watching their lectures and reading most of their books, but my room is literally full of college textbooks, all the way from bachelor's level and undergraduate all the way up to the PhD level. I've invested more money than I am comfortable admitting on textbooks on all of these subjects, which is partially why I'm like an encyclopedia of information on these topics. But more and more, the more that I've actually read these things and learned about the subject, the more that I've realized almost none of the recommendations that come out of scientific research communities are grounded in real world experience. They're not accurate. Okay, they're better, much better. They produce much better outcomes than people who just say fuck research and science. Science is bullshit, and then just do whatever crazy things they want, like raw vegan diets and breatharianism, or in exercise training, people just do. They kill themselves with 10 sets of 10 to failure on squats and deadlifts or something, or, people who do like sport training, athletic training, and like jujitsu or something, and they just spar hard every single day. Like, those people generally would do better if they followed research-based recommendations. Or people who will take probiotic supplements and raw green smoothies and stuff, and assume that those things are doing some kind of magical, health thing on them, when in reality, we know based on the research that they really don't do jack shit, and especially if you don't have the basics kind of handled right. Anyway, this in no way, shape, or form is a video against scientific research, okay? Research is extremely valuable. The problem is most people don't know the productive way of using it, and therefore they end up with a lot of problems that could be solved if they would disregard the scientific consensus and instead look towards large groups and communities of people who are getting the results that they desire, and then use the science to kind of explain the mechanisms afterwards and to fine-tune and tweak it. Okay? And that's a concept that the scientific people can't stand because they assume like, oh, we know more than enough with the research and it works just fine and blah, blah, blah. And then the people who are, anti-science, they just see no value in research at all. So anyway, let's get into some examples, all right? All right, so in the health sphere, okay, most people following my YouTube channel already know that mainstream nutrition science, even in regards to diseases, is entirely based upon calories, macro counting, and even things like food timing now are generally accepted, like protein timing and stuff like that. The general consensus in the nutrition community, even for disease prevention and disease reversal, they generally assume that there's no correlation or very, very low correlation between what you eat and, let's say the reversal of cancer. So or even things like autoimmune disease, right? Like if you look at what actually works for people as far as, let's say, putting Crohn's disease and irritable bowel syndrome into remission, okay? What works in the real world for most people, and I mean complete resolution of symptoms, is going to be removing a lot of the whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, okay? You'll see a lot, like there's hundreds of thousands of people who do raw vegan diets like I did at one point in time and experience complete remission in their intestinal disorder, as well as psoriasis and autoimmune conditions. But then at the same time, I got the same results by eating a diet based on exclusively red meat and fruits and non-starchy vegetable like, broccoli. The thing is, non-science people assume that removing meat and going raw vegan and eating only raw foods was the cure. They think it's magic. The meat people think that it's the meat that's magic. The reality is, the commonality is, hey, these whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds seem to aggravate my issues. It seems to be a trigger for some reason. The mainstream scientific community, okay, if you go to your doctor, for example, who I wouldn't say is necessarily even an academic at that point, they're a clinician. They generally don't really read a lot of research. I'm just being real here. Most don't have enough time or energy to do so. So I don't expect doctors to really be up to date on the research, to be honest, in that regard, because their lifestyle is so demanding. But what do they usually tell you? They say, oh, no, like diet has no correlation. Maybe avoid junk food and sugar and the normal stuff. But overall, like you need to get your colon removed. And that's the only way that you can overcome irritable bowel syndrome, right? So like literally the most cognitively lazy advice usually comes out of these people. The other one would be like, people who have PhDs in nutrition science, but they're like in the bodybuilding and fitness community, right? Their main client base is going to be people who are trying to compete in bodybuilding or fat loss clients. And they write books on fat loss, and their entire dissertation was on like protein metabolism. What these people generally say would be like, fiber is healthy. The greatest all the largest meta-analysis show, like a 3% relative risk reduction in IBS or something. Not kind of like admitting how little of a absolute difference it actually even makes if we're talking magnitude of effect. And this is the biggest problem with like scientific research on nutrition science, is that the majority of it, especially these large meta-analysis that we put at the very top of the hierarchy of evidence, which really shouldn't be the case. It's taking 100 different studies, all of varying quality, usually with different conclusions and different study methods and things. And we're trying to combine them all together, and then we're slapping some complicated mathematics on top of it to try to combine the data together and reach one absolute conclusion. When the reality is all the studies that they're combining, it doesn't matter what type of mathematics you use, okay? Or how careful you think you are with selecting the studies and their designs. The fact is, most of these studies that we combine together are not compatible. They're using, they have lots of confounding variables that you literally have to sit down and read each individual study one by one individually anyway, which defeats the entire purpose of combining them. And then it's like taking all of those different people, usually different populations, etc., and then slapping some calculus and whatever else on there. And then saying that that's the golden standard, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. To me, in regards to dynamic living human organisms, it makes like hardly any sense at all. To me, that shouldn't even be a major consideration. I don't see how useful that really is. I think individually, randomized controlled trials can be very useful, but even those need to be looked at with a huge grain of scrutiny and skepticism individually. And we need to understand study design, exclusion criteria, confounding and lingering variables, and then also have a good understanding of the magnitude of effect of each study in a real-world perspective, as well as the difference between relative risk and absolute risk. Most people don't understand any of this stuff. And a lot of these people do, but they just ignore it because the fact is, if we really looked at scientific research through a realistic lens, we would find that the majority of it is not as useful as you'd think. A lot of it is really a waste of time, unfortunately, on the researcher's part, but also as a consumer reading it. A lot of these studies, it's a lot of data, a lot of jargon. It's interesting and fascinating, but when you look at the percentage, the magnitude of effect in these studies, okay, meaning if we applied these things to the real world, these findings, how big of a difference does this data actually make? What does it actually mean? And you'll find that there's very little meaning in the conclusions of the studies. You have to make these things matter. You have to really dissect each individual study and look at what are they studying, what was the conclusion, what was the similarities in the groups of people, but then apply that to a wider range of research and experiences and knowledge bases. It gets to the point where it doesn't have as much relevance to real world meanings as people think, and it just isn't logical to use these things as a guiding principle. But anyway, so you get the majority of the mainstream consensus not actually, like, having no real usable recommendations for reversing disease, and even for things like fat loss and exercise training, okay? Training outcomes and like strength training protocols and things, okay? Now hear me out here, okay? So we know eating less energy, okay? And expending more energy, generally speaking, is the primary kind of contributing factor to fat loss. But some people get mad at me in the comments and dispute that, because of adaptive thermogenesis or whatever else, and compensations your body will make to try to remain in homeostasis at the body weight it's comfortable at. But overall, you have a wide range of variables that you can give people. You have intra-individual differences where, first of all, where you find that some people, they will lose body fat at a bigger deficit in energy or caloric intake. Some people might have worse outcomes in that regard and need a smaller deficit. Some people, for some reason, and you'll hear other people say like, oh, well, it's because the calorie deficit wasn't big enough. Some people, for some reason, when it seems like the more they restrict food, like the harder it is for them to lose weight. I don't know why that is, but anyone who's ever worked with a large client base will find that there's some people, in my experience, it's usually been shorter females, for some reason, they seem to have a much harder time losing weight through mainstream means. But anyway, there's a wide range of different variables of caloric intake and macronutrient needs to produce the same effect. And these studies generally will show that. The other thing, strength training, right? The recommendations for proper strength training are so wide that it gets to a point where you lose like practical relevance to a certain degree. Like they say, on average, 5 to 20 sets of 5 to 20 reps at 70 to 85% of your 1 rep max is a good starting point for productive progression in strength and muscle gains. And if you look at that, you're like, what the fuck? You're 65 to 85% of my 1 rep max, 5 to 20 sets of 5 to 20 reps. Like, what the hell? I mean, that's better than not having any place to start or any general guidelines, but that's a huge range to pull from, right? And even like protein needs, you'll hear recommendations like 0.8 grams per kilo to 2.2 grams per kilo and then every expert has a different opinion as to like the exact protein needs, right? Some people say, general rule of thumb, 1 gram per pound. Other people say, well, as long as you get 0.6 grams per pound, you're utilizing about as much protein as possible, and you're like, what the hell, do I believe? What's the point of even having guidelines based on scientific research if the guidelines have such a giant range? Anyway, in regards to health outcomes and preventing and reversing disease, you have very little useful guidelines that come out of the mainstream evidence-based research. And it should not surprise people that doctors a lot of times either give kind of far-fetched advice you never heard before that some people think they should lose their medical license over, or else they don't say anything about foods relation to disease or supplements or anything at all, right? Most of them they'll say, there's no evidence that that's the case. There's no science behind that being true or whatever. But it shouldn't surprise you that most people don't have any real, advice coming out of the mainstream camps, right? If it fits your macros people and the researchers that focus entirely on fat loss and whatnot, they'll say you're a quack if you believe that grains are bad for you or that sugar's bad for you or whatever. And they'll cite a bunch of cohort studies and epidemiology and all this other crap. And it just, they assume it's just genetics or we just don't know yet and therefore you're a quack if you have any evidence to the contrary. The fact is, if you look at it from a purely scientific standpoint and you have to have this criteria of research, first of all, the majority of the meta-analysis and crap will tell you things like high fiber intake is just a net positive no matter what, or high fruit and vegetable intake is good no matter what. And we still don't really know the mechanisms on a causal level. Some people will wrongfully tell you, they'll speak in absolutes and tell you, well, the gut microbiome, and fiber and the probiotics and this and that. Or the polyphenols and this and that. The fact is, though, almost all of that research is complete speculation from correlations as to the presence of the food in the diet and health outcomes, or the presence of gut microbiome in the gut and those people with certain strains of bacteria or in their gut having certain health outcomes. It's completely correlation and then speculation and assumptions based on the correlation. Just like sleep research. Okay, don't get me started on that. They insist that there's this magical range of sleep that everybody absolutely needs to be healthy, even though it's very obvious that there's a large portion of the population who sleeps completely outside that range, 4 to 6 hours a night, and they have no objective health markers being negatively affected or subjective feelings being negatively affected. And there's fearmongers on internet forums and research communities and things and podcasts who tell you Oh, you may not feel it right now, but trust me, you're going to develop type 2 diabetes eventually. Even though you don't have any signs of diabetes now from the amount of sleep you've been getting for the last 10 years, and you don't feel bad from this level of sleep, eventually it'll catch up to you because the speculative epidemiology correlation research says so. That is what you'll get from the most educated people with PhDs and stuff. Is they'll speak in absolutes and dooms, like threaten you, basically. If you don't fucking care about your sleep right now, by golly, just because you don't feel it right now, the research says, motherfucker, one day you're going to drop dead if you don't get the 7 to 10 hours of sleep the research claims you need, based completely on correlation and free living populations who are forced to sleep that much. Damn it. So, yeah, sleep research, oh my god, I made a complete video at timestamps explaining why it's nonsense, but people don't want to believe it. They still have this, like, blind faith that just because they've heard their entire lives that, 7 to 8 hours a night is mandatory, that somehow Jocko Willink and Donald Trump and all these other people who literally can't sleep more than 6 hours a night and feel amazing and are, like, the most productive people in society. And I'm not a Trump person, but like, it's not like he's like underperforming per se, but I don't know, whatever. Okay. Maybe not the best examples, but you get what I'm saying is like, there are too many countless examples of people who, the sleep research, right? Plenty of high level athletes are in the top 1% of all athletics and you have very little sleep. They get under the recommended research amount of sleep. Entrepreneurs, high-level military personnel, and the list goes on and on and on. Even Einstein and some of these, like, highly creative people. Even from a health standpoint, right? There's, like, super centenarians that are on record saying they wake up in the middle of the night to drink coffee and smoke a cigar. And they say they only sleep like 4 to 6 hours a night sometimes, and they have their entire life. So, anyway, so that's the sleep research. It doesn't actually match up to real world standards. And then we have like disease reversal. Okay, so many people who actually are reversing, again, let's say autoimmune and digestive disease. They do diets that the science says shouldn't be happening. The science says eating your fruits and vegetables should make a healthy immune system and like has all these polyphenols and gut bacteria stuff that controls autoimmunity and all this crap. That's what they say. There's entire like autoimmune protocols completely revolving around the idea, like the GAPS protocol, revolving around the idea that you need to fortify your immune system and your gut flora and all this stuff, and fermented foods and taking glutamine in order to resolve autoimmune disease, because they claim that it's the gut bacteria that's in control of that. But then you have these people who literally just don't even care about that, like myself. I actually did for a long time try that protocol. It didn't work for me, just wasted a bunch of money, time, and energy. Eventually I was like, screw it. I'm going to cut out whatever foods seem to be triggering my symptoms. And then I basically went with a very basic paleo-style diet of just meat, fruit, and non-starchy veg. And all my symptoms went away. And that was after a year of doing like the Michael Greger evidence-based vegan diet with proper supplements and everything. And before that, I had found that a raw vegan diet completely resolved all my digestive and autoimmune symptoms too, but just made me feel weak and lethargic all the time and gave me insomnia and stuff. So anyway, it was like the whole grains are supposed to be one of the healthiest foods you can eat. And I was so scared I was going to be nutrient deficient because the almighty recommended daily intake of nutrients, okay, was like telling me like, hey, you need the magnesium and the potassium and all this other crap. And then the probiotics and the fiber and on, and that I need carbs for exercise performance, which I now know as a 4-year super low carb athlete that I don't actually need carbs for performance, but science told me otherwise, right? pretty much I suffered for years because I was looking for the answers to my health problems and my exercise performance problems in the mainstream scientific community, and their advice hurt me, actually. And I was clearly getting bad negative results from it. And it's funny because before I even paid attention to eating healthy and stuff, I felt fine. Well, not fine. I had some problems. Don't get me wrong. A lot of problems, actually. But when I tried to eat healthy was when I felt the worst. Okay, and when I followed exercise training things that I thought were science based, I started feeling the worst too. Pretty bad. But exercise science, I think, helped me more than it harmed me. But nutrition science completely fucked me for a long time. So anyway, real world examples of what actually works in the real world are not do not reflect what the science says very much, okay? What I eventually realized is the recommended daily intake of nutrients are not based on solid evidence that suggests, hey, if you don't get these RDIs every day, then you're at risk of a deficiency. That's not really how it works. No population of humans had epidemics of deficiency diseases until the refined foods started coming into play. It doesn't look like it's about getting your essential nutrients every day that's the problem. What it looks like is if you eat refined foods, you can create a deficiency from the refined foods somehow. For whatever reason. It looks like refined foods that actually strip your body of nutrients. But the problem is we have these recommended daily minimum of nutrients that the government says we need, which is purely marketing to try to offset the unhealthy stigma on unhealthy foods. It's funny because, if you read the book Vitamania by Catherine Price, highly recommend it, what you see is as soon as we started to discover new vitamins, cereal, Reese's Cup cereal, and even sodas, and junk food like cupcakes and stuff, and Pop-Tarts, man. All these junk foods, refined foods that are mostly refined flour and sugar, they started getting marketed as health foods and getting marketed towards children. And they are only able to do that by adding a ton of vitamin C and iron, which is actually pro-oxidative, and all these other vitamins and minerals and things that were synthetically derived, right? And they just fortified all their junk foods with vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and stuff. Then they were able to market it as healthy because it's a giant source of these vitamins and minerals that we actually don't even need to be supplementing. And so it's more of a marketing thing. But everybody just assumes it's evidence-based now. I mean, look at all the famous people through the 80s and 90s, right, who were like, eat your vitamins, get your vitamins and you'll be healthy like Popeye. Eat your spinach. It's like, motherfucker, there's no amount of spinach that you can eat if you don't get your protein in that's going to give you big biceps like Popeye. All that's going to happen is you're going to fart all day, potentially get oxalate crystals built up in your damn kidneys and get kidney stones and just blow out your colon with all the gas accumulated. But you could eat all the spinach you want. If spinach is all you ate, trust me when I say you would have muscle wasting syndrome, okay? But if you ate a bunch of meat and did some strength training, then you might look like Popeye. And I should know because people tell me I look like Popeye because of my damn forearms. Legit, though. But anyway, so what I'm getting at is in nutrition science, right? People don't fucking reverse their diseases by eating if it fits your macros diets or calorie counting diets. In strength training, people don't get strong by doing there's no exact range of reps and sets and volume given by scientific training research. Okay, there's a giant range in which you just have to find what works for you in that range. And then the whole RP thing and leaving reps in the tank. There's a lot of people who, for some reason, don't really get very good results with RP. Maybe because they're undershooting, who knows. But there's a lot of people who, when they just do one set to failure, which is completely outside the realm of the science-based communities, that they start blowing up and making all this progress all of a sudden. And there's people out there who have been vegan for a long time, or have just been doing a whole foods diet, or they've been supplementing vitamins and minerals or whatever. There's people out there who have been like obsessively trying to get, the 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night or whatever. And they find when they just allow their body to sleep 6 hours a night, all of a sudden they have all this newfound energy they never had before. And so what I'm trying to say is that, a lot of times you could spend all this time obsessing over scientific jargon and whatnot and trying to be as scientifically correct as possible. But when it comes down to it, you might be way better off looking for large groups of people who are actually finding success with certain things and just experimenting. And I mean at least 30 days. Like if we're talking nutrition, because a lot of people, they only do a week or two and they're like, oh, didn't work for me, haha. That's not an honest experiment, but I mean a 30-day experiment to see what happens, and then using science to fine-tune it, right? A lot of people just go down the wrong path, or they get negative results, or they just kind of float up and down when they go complete scientific consensus approach, right? And I think it just goes to show you there's a reason why Joe Rogan's podcast is has some 3 or 4 times the viewers or the exposure or whatever than mainstream news like CNN and crap. But I guess that's an unrelated point. But people criticize Joe Rogan for being like bro Rogan or bro science or something. And all the evidence-based people hate Joe Rogan and they're like crapping on him. And there's a scientific elitism that goes on where it's like if you're not speaking, advice and recommendations that's in alignment with the mainstream consensus of science, then you're just a conspiracy theorist or you're like a quack or something. But the question is, first of all, what is the scientific consensus? Because if you've ever watched debates or what they call scientific roundtables where they have multiple experts kind of debate research in a podcast, which I watch a lot, you'll find even amongst the people who you believe are the consensus of a certain scientific community, they have very different opinions and approaches all amongst each other, right? For nutrition, some people believe a little bit more carbs are better, a little bit more salt is better, more protein is better, or more fat is better in the diet, right? Or they believe intermittent fasting is good or it's bad or it's neutral, or they believe that calories are all that matters and, just get your protein in and then if it fits your macros, it's all golden. There is a wide, even in the vegan communities, some people that are like, you need omega-3s, get it from algae, or you need to supplement vitamin D or vitamin B12, and then others just say that's all bullshit. Some people say a grain-based diet is ideal, or you need to get a certain amount of protein or you don't. So I'm just saying, even in the so-called scientific consensus, there is a large degree of debate. So, and it's interesting to me because, for at least the people I've been paying attention to, in the exercise science community, there's more and more people who are coming out and saying, hey, look, a lot of the scientific evidence and jargon and stuff, and these evidence-based practitioners are bamboozling you to sell you their own coaching services, to sell you their books and their programs. They're making it sound a lot more complicated than it needs to be, so you're relying on their information. They're giving you a problem and then selling you the solution, right? They're creating an artificial problem that doesn't exist. The science is important, you got to understand the science and all this crap. And then 700 videos later, you've binge-watched their content, and you still aren't getting progress. And they're selling you their programs and shit as a solution. And the fact is, people have been getting great results for decades before these evidence-based, strength training people came out, or, people have been healthy with no nutrient deficiencies for decades before functional medicine practitioners came out with vitamin and mineral questionnaires that I used to promote, right? Like you have serotonin deficiency and all this other crap. Like people never needed that crap until we got refined foods. And then we got berry and, all these other things. People stopped eating, fatty animal foods, so they got vitamin A deficiency and all this other crap. And now people think beta-carotene is real vitamin A thanks to the reductionist, plant-based paradigm and all this other crap. And people just put all their freaking energy and time into the wrong things. So, and even in like the freaking supplement industry, right? So let's talk about herbs and supplements. Like I get comments like sometimes like essays on my damn YouTube comments from people trying to explain to me like rhodiola, it's an MAOI inhibitor, or it increases serotonin and this and that, and it builds a tolerance over time, and it needs to blah, 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 and this and that. And the reality is the research doesn't speak in absolutes, but you're assuming it does. And it's just not useful. It really, what's useful is, looking at the intervention trials to look at the forms that are being used, the dosage ranges that are being used, and then is it better to start at a lower dose than titrate up? And then looking at other people's experiences too. But when you start to talk about dopamine, serotonin, receptor sites, testosterone and DHT, and these reductionist concepts, they can help you troubleshoot. But most people this has been my experience and why I'm just completely disillusioned now by the scientific type mentality is that the more people look into that, like I notice they have trouble sticking to one thing for a long time. They'll take an herb like rhodiola for like 3 days and be like, oh shit, it made me depressed and all this other crazy shit, and it's probably the estrogen signaling in the hypothalamus pituitary 5A receptor site. And it's like, bro, you only took that shit for 3 days. You didn't experiment with more or less of a dosage. You didn't try a different type of extract or a different strain. You literally just tried it for like 2 days, and then your mind went all over the place in like a intellectual tornado. And now you don't even know what actually happened because you didn't give it an honest trial. So, yeah. Or people who insist that certain herbs build tolerance over time. There are so many different potential mechanisms at play that could give you that experience. Like, for example, at rhodiola, people, it gives you a tolerance. Most people take rhodiola at the right dosage, don't experience any tolerance or any lowered kind of like effect over time per se. What you find is, especially if you're taking like a higher dose, like 500 milligrams a day, that it can make you more sedated. And over time, it actually gets more effective is a problem. So what people think is a tolerance to rhodiola is actually it building up in your system over time. And then eventually what you think is a tolerance to rhodiola, for example, is actually that it's sedative now because it's such a high doses in your system, in your bloodstream. And it's probably down-regulated different enzymes and things at that point. That actually you just need a lower dose to continue the effect. But people think that they built a tolerance and need to cycle it. When in reality, that's not really how rhodiola should be taken, per se. But it can be taken that way, don't get me wrong. But even things like ashwagandha, right? People think it either is the best thing ever because it lowers cortisol and does all this other crap. Or else people think it is a bad thing and it's a doomsday herb and you should avoid it at all costs because, it raises thyroid hormone and does all this other crap and lowers your ambition motivation. And the fact is, there's like 8 completely different extracts of ashwagandha that all have completely different subjective and objective effects. And different dosage ranges for different people, taken at different times too, are going to completely change the effect. For example, if you take a really small dosage of ashwagandha KSM 66 in the morning, it can have an energizing effect, boost your libido and motivation, all this stuff. But if you take a higher dose, even the recommended lower range dose, like 600 milligrams in the morning, it could actually make you feel a little too calm, a little too lethargic, or whatever. And you might feel better taking it before bed. It could actually enhance your sleep. But people just are like, it's the worst thing ever. Stay away from it at all costs. And it's like, bro, it's so much more complicated than that. The reductionist mentality gets you nowhere when it comes to nutrition science, herb science, supplement science, and exercise science. But, researching things and being curious about things is way better than not. Because the worst part of all this are the mainstream science people who say, there's no freaking supplement on the market that's going to help you in your depression or your anxiety or your sleep. Or help you with your exercise training or whatever. Because if there was an effective supplement on the market, it would be illegal. It would be considered a steroid, or it would be a pharmaceutical medication. And the reality is that's just not true. That's coming from someone who doesn't actually understand the research on these things, even though they specialize oftentimes in breaking down research on their YouTube channels. But only when it comes to like fat loss and, whenever it supports their own agenda and worldview. So, yeah, I don't know, man. This has been all over the place. You don't need vitamin C necessarily from your diet. People think you do. You don't need plant foods per se to live, but you could feel free to eat them if you'd like. You don't even need to eat carbohydrates for exercise performance or anything either. But your, willingness to believe that's going to depend completely on your previous experiences and what you want to believe. But there's the majority of people think that if you don't eat carbs, your body just magically stops producing glucose. And this is the mainstream nutrition advice. Problem is, most of the studies showing exercise performance at higher intensities relying on carbs and only burns carbs, those studies were done on carb-adapted athletes that have been eating carbs their whole life. And if you stop eating carbs for 2 weeks, your body has to go through a several-week adaptation process before it can start to burn fat at higher intensities. But if you look at the research on athletes that have been adapted to a high carb or a low carb diet for long enough, you see that athletes eventually build the capacity to burn fatty acids at up to 90% of their VO2 max or more, and they actually can burn 2 grams of fat per minute compared to the high carb athletes who burn less than 1 gram of fat per minute to fuel exercise. So, all these assumptions and everything else that we think are facts based on scientific research is just not real. And you get to a point where you realize science is in the eye of the beholder. And it's counterproductive to the entire intention behind it in the first place when you use it as a guiding principle. You're like, no, you must eat carbs, science says so. You must get your RDIs, science says so. You must eat fibrous fruits and vegetables, science says so. There is no cure for autoimmune disease, science says so. There's no correlation between your diet and cancer, science says so, or whatever it might be. And then you have all these people who are actually getting results that are contrary to what these science-based people say, doing so-called pseudoscientific protocols. And nah, it's all placebo. That person doesn't exist or whatever. Somehow it's all placebo. They healed their cancer with placebo or whatever. Or they're lying or whatever it is. Or it's a 1 in a million chance. It's just by random chance they did it. There's no cause and effect there. Honestly, I don't know what the word, disillusioned is what I usually say, but I'm kind of bothered by people who are I'm science-based these days. I consider myself an evidence-based practitioner, but I just wonder what the hell does that even mean these days? To me now, it's this weird thing where I'm well, as long as you're getting results, that's really what matters. But the problem is, if you're doing a dangerous protocol, you might, that you're getting results in one area, you might fuck yourself up in another. Raw veganism might cure all your autoimmune and digestive diseases, but if you're not getting enough protein to sustain your body tissue, then you can run into problems. And because it's almost exclusively carbohydrate, triglycerides might go up, you might develop some insulin resistance, but if you're in the vegan paradigm, then you'll believe all that shit's bullshit. You don't need protein. Fat is the cause of diabetes, they say, and all this other stuff. So, and even people like Durian Ryder, sugar is a health food. Sprite is a health food, he says. So, it's just, I don't even know how to describe it. I could say like, oh, you know, these evidence-based people are more of a joke than they realize. But the fact is, it's actually way better to be in the evidence-based paradigm than it is to be in the quackery. But I feel like people just need a more open, kind of critical thinking, highly skeptical approach where they look for what works and then use science to kind of like understand what's working. But people instead, they look at science as like the starting point, and then anecdotes either do or do not reflect the science, but it doesn't matter because science is king. And it just puts people in this weird like cognitive dissonance, or this weird like ignoring paradigm where, you know, I don't care if you've healed all these diseases eating nothing but meat. That's all bullshit and whatever. You need fiber and all this other crap. And I've had conversations with these people where I ask them, I'm like, well, you think that carnivore people are like bullshitters or whatever, but like, what if there's like people who have documented evidence that they've completely reversed their disease, and every time they add grains or whatever else back in, it flares their problems up again? And they'll say something like, well, that's just a very, very small minority of people, but that's the exception, not the rule. And you shouldn't let the few people that actually are legitimate, like, cloud out the evidence-based paradigm that works for most people. And it's like, I mean, I just feel like these people have like blinders on, and they're not realizing that, they're not seeing that most people aren't getting the great results that we think. Even like sustainable fat loss methods, like, people are like, no, keto's not sustainable. You need to do a calorie restricted, if it fits your macros approach for long-term success. And I'm sorry, but how many people do you know that are not serious bodybuilders or whatever, that make fitness their life, that actually count calories and track food and do it for the rest of their life? And I guess you don't really need to track food. After a while, it becomes intuitive. But most people that I've found, if they're not tracking meticulously and they're just regular people who aren't actually bodybuilders and live in the gym, they want to eat their cake every now and then and eat it too, and not track calories and stuff. And it gets to a point where telling them, hey, get your protein macro goal and then just limit the calories and don't binge on weekends, that works when these people are motivated for like a year. But it gets to a point where if they're not training with you anymore, they're not tracking, they don't care about fitness, the majority of these people, that's why so-called diets don't work, okay? And the thing about keto is, as long as you don't have a make it or break it paradigm, if you give these people simple principles that aren't necessarily evidence-based, but they kind of are, this is what I do, is like, hey, look, prioritize protein first, okay? Try to get the equivalent of your body weight or your goal body weight in protein. Eventually they realize, oh, it's about 2 pounds of meat a day, and they can kind of eyeball it. And then just make sure that you limit added carbs and fats to the highest degree that you can. And if you eat a little bit of carbs here and there, that's okay. If you eat some cake on the weekend or go crazy, that's okay, provided you go back to the basic principles I mentioned before on the weekdays, which is prioritize protein first, and then limit the added fats and carbs. Try to eat lean proteins to minimize the fat calories, and then as long as they're kind of like keeping their carbs on check, you know, like they can have, their carbs are going to ebb and flow naturally. These people might have some pasta here and there, but they see like basically reducing portions of these added energy that's basically contributing to the fat gain anyway. They see that as, you know, enriching the fat. And so, and the other thing is, most fucking people don't give a shit about scientific evidence either. Even doctors. You'd be surprised. Hundreds of my clients over the years who have told me they've gone to their doctor and asked them about protein intake and fitness and all this stuff, or even supplements. No doctor has any kind of scientific understanding. Most doctors don't have a scientific understanding of these things. Most of what I've heard so many like doctors give bro advice. Like, it's crazy. I've even heard doctors say that diabetes is completely genetic and it doesn't matter what you eat. So there is like a huge illusion that science, about how much science actually matters. And I hate saying that because it makes me sound like I'm not credible. But people who actually understand these things, I think, would know that what I'm saying is not necessarily wrong. It just depends on how extreme you think I'm being and how you interpret it. I'm just saying, like, most people that you meet as a clinician don't want to hear science, don't care about science. They just want to know what works. And you as a clinician need to know what works and need to know the potential negative effects of it and then know how to tweak it as time goes on. But you don't need to fucking do what I did and obsess over textbooks and shit. But like, for me, basically what I found by obsessively looking at research over time is that I found that the majority of things that people think are science-based are actually bullshit. And if they work for reasons that are other than what the science says. Like, plant-based, high-fiber diets don't induce weight loss because of gut microbiome, or they do it by suppressing hunger and filling up bulk in your stomach. And most people have better health outcomes from fiber-rich diets, not because these fiber-rich diets are healthy, but because they're avoiding a lot of the refined carbs, because they're opting for brown rice instead of white rice and etc. So they're limiting their sugar intake and glycemic load. So anyway, I got to get to work and train my clients now, but like, hopefully this video made sense. Honestly, I feel like people are going to start listening to it and just think it's a bunch of uninspired jargon, and then they're just going to be like, nah, I'm going to go and I'm going to read a bunch of bullshit biohacking and other crap. Read about, correcting my posture and how like flat-footedness leads to injury and all this other stupid shit it's not actually real. And how like caloric restriction is the key to longevity and all this other stupid shit. Like, all right, I guess. So I don't know how to deal with this. This shit plagues me, and honestly, it makes me like, it's hard to make video content now because I'm always like, oh shit, I'm going to tell people the golden tidbits at work and it's going to transform their life, but they're going to think I'm a quack because it's not science-based. There's always going to be those people in the comments. Can I see a reference for that? Which I actually do. I'm one of those trolls. Anyway, leave your question, comments down below, and I'll talk to y'all next time.